My name is Carrie Cranston. I'm the president of the American Writers Museum. And so tonight's program, we're glad you could join us. And I want to first acknowledge that tonight's program is part of our series sponsored by the NEA Big Read program. NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts and is in partnership with Arts Midwest. Tonight is the latest in a number of programs we're offering in conjunction with the Bradbury exhibit. We're here to talk about one of the most important ways in which Fahrenheit 451 became such a major part of public consciousness, and that was through its serialization in Playboy magazine. Here are the 3 issues that it appeared in the March, April, and the May issues of 1954. And to talk about that extraordinary moment with us is Christie Hefner, former chairman and CEO of Playboy Enterprises, a business leader, an innovator, activist, philanthropist, and staunch defender of the First Amendment. So please help me in welcoming Christie Hefner.
Thanks very much, Carrie, for that warm introduction. It's very nice to be with you, even if it's virtual.
Yes, and it's good to see you again. And so thanks for joining us for this. We're excited to kind of talk through a lot of these different topics. We talked to Sam Weller, the biographer of Ray Bradbury, a while back. And this is actually, it's a part of the exhibit. Behind me here, we have those original issues. Can you tell me a little bit about how important do you think it was for Playboy in its infancy as a publication? It had only, I think it was the 5th, 6th, and 7th issue to serialize Fahrenheit 451.
I think it was very important. I mean, my father's vision for the magazine was to create this sophisticated new men's lifestyle magazine for his generation of returning veterans from World War II who were looking at their lives and wanting them to be somewhat different than their father's lives had been. And part of that was the idea of kind of a bachelorhood before marriage and family. And so having a positioning that was upscale was really essential. And that meant that quality was really important, whether that was the ads or the illustration and certainly the writing. But I also think it was important because I think that, my dad very much understood that he was going to be challenging conventions in the magazine and breaking taboos. So I think the subject matter of Fahrenheit 451 and its challenge to orthodoxy and to censorship, I have to believe had a special appeal to him.
Yeah. And do you know anything specific about why your father decided to do this at an early time in the publication?
What I know is, not surprisingly, because he was not a company, he was a person, the magazine started with limited capital. And in fact, he would share later that he had mortgaged our furniture twice to have enough money to put out the first issue, and had deliberately not put the month of December on the cover because he knew from his years at Esquire that the way the magazine newsstand business worked is that once you were at the end of the month on the cover, whatever hadn't been sold, the newsstand dealers returned back for money. And his theory was if they didn't know it was the end of its on sale period, he might get a little extra on sale period, which would give him a little extra money to be able to print the second issue. So in fact, the first issue featured in its fiction a public domain short story by Arthur Conan Doyle, because of course there were no rights to be paid. And that was how they got started. But he had read the paperback edition of Fahrenheit 451, which is all that had been published up to that point. And I think it was published in October, so very shortly before Playboy magazine started. And he would say that he was a big fan of the work. And so he thought, this is a chance to kind of put a big stake in the ground in terms of bringing to our audience this important and powerful work. And so he wrote to Ray, and I think the story goes, he offered him $400 to serialize it in 3 separate issues. And Ray said yes. And it's interesting because subsequently there would be a hardcover deal for Fahrenheit, which who knows, but may have been helped along by its visibility in the magazine. But I know for sure that Hef felt that it was the kind of fiction that was both of its time and timeless.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think, what impact do you think publishing that particular work, and serializing something like that was so new had on the magazine at the time, and then also over the years?
I think, especially in hindsight, it's really interesting that both Fahrenheit itself as a work of fiction and Playboy were both in that early 50s period, because we tend to think of the 50s as the Eisenhower years, as a period of great conformity, from the banal man in the gray flannel suit, happy housewife, to the scary, McCarthy era. And I might add that Ray was one of the very few writers in the Screenwriters Guild who vehemently objected to the loyalty oaths that were being imposed. But the reality is, with the benefit of historical perspective, that a lot of the seeds of ferment and change that sort of blossomed late in the 50s and the early 60s were really planted in the early to mid 50s. So you have the sexual revolution, the Kinsey report is coming out. You have the early stirrings of the women's movement, of the civil rights movement. You have that kind of rebelliousness in the arts, whether it was, what Ray was writing, or whether it was Jack Kerouac, Miles Davis, who incidentally was the very first Playboy interview done by Alex Haley. You have things like, Jackson Pollock and that kind of art movement. So there's this interesting kind of tension, I think, in the 50s that made it a time of ferment that created the opportunity for rebels. And I think that made it the right time.
Yeah, I think it's a good synopsis of those conflicting things that were happening at that point. And I think also, as you said, people may not think of Ray Bradbury as radical. And yet at the time, that story and that book were fairly radical.
Very much so. And I think Ray was proud of the fact that it was a banned book.
Yeah. The idea that you would write a book about book burning and censorship and have it get banned.
I know. It's too ironic, right?
Yes. You're someone, who ran the publication of Playboy and the enterprises and everything behind it. So you've faced issues of censorship, which is obviously that theme of the book, the idea of being able to cancel thoughts and ideas. How important do you find Fahrenheit 451 to be today? Do you think it's something that should still be taught as it is in schools? Is it out of date? What do you feel about it as a work now?
I think it stands the test of time. I think it is both relevant and resonant. And I know Ray was a big fan of myths. Mm-hmm. And I think of Fahrenheit 451 as a kind of a timeless modern myth that has not been made irrelevant with the passage of now 70 years. Because if you really take a step back from today, and of course, the American Writers Museum grapples with this all the time too, so it's really relevant that we're having this conversation, that the same instinct to censor, or to use the vernacular today, to cancel, that was at the heart of the dynamic that Ray was writing about in the early 50s is there in a big way in contemporary society, as is, I would argue, a kind of anti-intellectualism that also was a part of what Ray was attacking. And I think that the book, in talking about as its theme, freedom and oppression and democracy, I think it just reminds us that it's a kind of a call to action, that we can't afford to be complacent. Ray once said that he felt that he was Montag, who is the kind of hero of the book, who begins the book as a fireman, who, for those who haven't read the book or haven't read it in a while, as the society has devolved as opposed to evolved, the firemen are now charged with actually finding and burning books. And the whole principle there is that the society and the powers that be feel that books are too dangerous because they cause unhappiness. They raise questions that can't be answered. They provoke conflict, and that the society and its citizens needs to be protected from those things. And I think that there is a similar dynamic that is going on, whether it's around safe spaces on college campuses or in the debate, in what it gets published today. So I just feel that it's maybe more timely even than ever before. And I loved one of the comments that Ray once said about Fahrenheit 451. He said, I wasn't trying to predict the future, I was trying to prevent it.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. And I think you bring up a really good point in the sense that we tend to focus on this book and its notion of censorship. Mm-hmm. But there's a notion to censorship that is well thought out. In other words, people are carefully trying to take things away from people. But you also brought up the anti-intellectualism of it, and that notion of not wanting to recognize the work that people do, that is intellectual, that is analysis, that is science, and that's very much a big part of the book. It's not just the idea of censorship; it's also just being against the idea of thought in general.
Yeah, and think of how in our own society, in some quarters, the word elite has become, kind of a sign of disrespect where it used to be a sign of respect.
Yeah, definitely. I'm curious, over the years, Ray did other interviews with Playboy and was involved. What kind of relationship did your father have with Ray, and what kind of relationship did Ray have with Playboy itself?
Yeah, they were friends, and I think that there were certain things that bonded them and bound them. One was unquestionably the deep sort of anathema they both felt towards censorship and the deep commitment in favor of freedom of expression. And I think that was something that was clearly shared. But I also think that they enjoyed each other as kind of creative people. I do think both of them were visionaries, and that it reflected itself in different ways. But certainly, I think arguably my father was a visionary in terms of what he created with Playboy, but Ray was a super visionary too, and had this sort of expansive sense of what interested him. He would talk about going to the Chicago World's Fair when he was 12 and just being fascinated by these sort of little glimpses of what the future might be, and became a huge fan of everything from magic to architecture. And I actually got to know him in my years working at the company, and he was just this polymath. I mean, he just had this breadth and depth of curiosity and interest. And I think that was kind of a part of what bound them together. They were both highly opinionated, for sure, and sure of their opinions. And I know Ray had a sign, I don't know if it's part of the exhibit, over his typewriter that said, "Don't think," because he had this very strong belief that writers needed to write from a place of feeling and not overthink, and actually was pretty harsh in his belief that writers shouldn't go to school to learn to write. He wasn't anti-intellectual, but that writing had to be from your life experiences. I saw a wonderful interview that was done when Ray was quite ill already. So this was back in 2010, when the Writers Guild in LA brought my dad and Ray together for a little kind of interview. And I think it was the first time that they had been together for a few years, because Ray had not been in very good health. And it gave my dad a chance to say that he was both honored and proud to have published Fahrenheit 451. But he also shared something that I hadn't known before that he wanted to publicly thank Ray for, which was not for the writing that Ray himself had done, but that there was another writer, Charles Beaumont, who happened to also be a Chicagoan, who Ray had mentored and brought to the magazine, to Playboy, and said, this is a really gifted young writer, and you ought to take a look at him before he'd really become well known. Mm-hmm. And again, back in 54 or 55, Playboy published an original short story of his called Black Country, and then published a piece that became a really important piece in the history of the magazine, and as we're discussing, its willingness to take on controversial issues. And it was called The Crooked Man. And the premise of the piece was a future in which what you think is happening is it's kind of a pre-Stonewall period where people who are homosexual have to be in hiding and meet secretly. And only at the end of the story is the twist revealed, which is that on this planet, in this world, at this time, it's the reverse. And heterosexuality is the stigmatized, crooked, minority form of sexuality. And this was 1955, which was a pretty astonishing time to have published something like that. And so at that occasion, have had the chance to say to Ray, thank you for bringing Charles Beaumont to us, who would go on, I might add, to write some of the most memorable and impactful episodes of Twilight Zone.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think that connection between, Playboy and fiction in general, it was so important to the magazine, and I'm curious, your thoughts about how it defined the magazine and how you think it might have made the magazine special.
Well, certainly as a former English major, I was greatly appreciative of the fact that pretty much Playboy and the New Yorker were the two magazines that were publishing not just excerpts of novels, but original short fiction, and provided platforms for younger writers, as we were just discussing in the context of Beaumont, but also a way of reaching a larger audience than, say, a collection or an anthology of short fiction might reach. It was the only category that Playboy magazine was ever nominated for a National Magazine Award, was in fiction. So that was kind of exciting. And when you go back and look at the list of fiction writers that appeared in the magazine, it's an overused expression, but it truly is a who's who. It's everybody from Margaret Atwood and Joyce Carol Oates and John Updike and John Irving and Nadine Gordimer and Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Gore Vidal, and just everybody. And it in part was because here was a magazine that was reaching millions and millions of readers, but not dumbing down what the content, either the nonfiction or the fiction was.
Yeah, and how fast did Playboy take off then? It became so gigantic, and of course, when he there, as you said, he was mortgaging the furniture to get it off the ground. But how quickly did that growth happen?
Pretty quickly. We did not have our furniture repossessed, so that was a early good sign. I do not remember having to sleep in a drawer and a dresser in the bedroom. But yeah, it was, I won't remember the exact date, but it surpassed Esquire easily in its first decade, which was kind of the inspiration of sophisticated men's magazine. And I think it was that classic, the right idea at the right time, executed brilliantly, that is what is the magic mix.
Yeah. And you mentioned Esquire, and your father worked at Esquire, and it was sort of that magazine. What was it that took him from Esquire to want to launch his own? What was the driving?
Two things. One, maybe a little mundane, and one more philosophical. The mundane was that Esquire had some of its offices at the time my dad worked for them in Chicago. And he was actually not on the editorial side. He was working on promotional copy for them. And a decision got made that they were going to move all of their offices to New York. And they only offered certain people jobs in New York, but they did offer my dad a job in New York. So that was kind of a cool thing. But he really loved Chicago, and he really didn't think he would like New York that much. And the way sometimes you think in life you want a sign. So he went back to his manager and he asked for a $5 a week raise to go to New York with his then baby me and his wife. And the manager said, you know, Mr. Hefner, we're not even extending, job offers to all of our employees, and you should be grateful that you're getting it. And no, we're not giving you a $5 a week raise. And Hef saw it as a sign that he should stay. And I should say that years later, at the 25th anniversary of the magazine, I put the promotional plan together that led to the start of the First Amendment Awards and some other things. But we also did a roast at Tavern on the Green to create a journalism scholarship in my dad's name at the University of Illinois. And Clay Felker was the then editor of Esquire. And he got up and told that story and then said, we've been watching you, Hef, and we think that we're prepared to offer you a job back with back pay, and pulled out this huge $5 bill. So that was the sort of mundane piece. And I think the philosophical piece was that my dad felt that some of the smart sexiness of Esquire, the cartoons and the petty girls, and the willingness to understand that there was a sexual revolution going on, they'd retreated from that and had become more cautious, more conservative, and that created a space.
Okay, very interesting. I'm kind of curious, when we're talking about Bradbury and we're talking about some of these issues, and you brought it up a little bit, but in our modern information-driven world with the web and social media, I'd asked before if the book is dated, and do you think that the notion of book burning carries any weight when our world is so digital?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think that it does, because I think it's such a powerful metaphor that it kind of transcends what the form of the distribution of the content is. And I know Ray would talk about how, he was coming of age at a time when, radio was dominant, then television was becoming, the form of kind of mass communication. And that worried him in terms of, would that have an impact on people reading less? He worried about whether that would impact on libraries, which, as you know, he loved passionately. Although I would add that when you think about the early 1950s, when he wrote Fahrenheit, those images of those huge flat screen TVs that are so dominant in the book, wow, talk about having sort of a prescient vision for the world we now live in 70 years later. I know that was pretty cool. But he was, I think, worried about whether different forms would not just impact the power of the idea of book burning, but even more fundamentally, the power of reading and how we take in information. And certainly he lived long enough to see the internet, and maybe not as much the power of social media, but the internet. And I know before he died, he talked about that, and that he understood in the positive way the kind of global connectivity that the web represented, and could see the positive in that. But I know, he worried a lot that it would change how people read, who they read, and how much they had a sense of kind of yesterday. And I think those are concerns that we are grappling with today.
Yeah. And you brought up the notion of this is, the metaphor of book burning, not the literal nature of it. And, the book is an allegory in sort. So I guess my question is, what do you see as the biggest threats then today to free speech? I think you touched on it a little bit, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, because obviously this is an area where you've worked in for so long.
Right. Well, I alluded to what's happening on campuses, and I do worry about the tendency to want to disinvite speakers whose points of view are at odds with the majority of the campus, or to try and excise from reading lists books of different points of view. And indeed, even though we live in a very digital world, the American Library Association's Freedom to Read Foundation, which is based here in Chicago and with whom I've worked closely, particularly in conjunction with the First Amendment Awards, would tell you that there is no diminution in efforts to censor books in libraries and in schools today. That is still a real and ongoing challenge, and it comes from both sides of the political spectrum. So you can have the efforts to censor the kinds of books that deal with marginalized communities, whether it's LGBTQ communities or other minority communities from one side of the spectrum, but you can also have from the other side the inclination to censor books that are dealing with, say, racism, but include racist language. And so the need to kind of push back on that and to just continue to reinforce the idea that the whole idea of books and of reading is to reach across boundaries, to show us both what we have in common, but also to open us up to worlds that are different than the worlds that we're familiar with. And sometimes that means challenging us, and that is something that we should treasure, because we need to understand our differences and our similarities. And I think that only by doing that are we actually going to create a society that is respectful and pluralistic, which is at its heart what our democracy is founded on. And I also think that willingness to be challenged, and we talked about it earlier in the context of what's in Fahrenheit 451, which is the government's feeling that people have to be protected from ideas that might challenge them or make them uncomfortable or offend them. And that we have to push back against that now, just as much as Ray was pushing back against that in the 50s.
Yeah. And you've mentioned offhand a couple of times the Hugh Hefner First Amendment. Can you talk a little bit about those awards? You created them, what are they? Why are they so important? Tell us about them.
Well, they are near and dear to my heart. So during the 25th anniversary, so this was 1979, we were looking for kind of special ways to celebrate the anniversary. And as I mentioned, we launched this journalism scholarship. We toured the art collection, but we also decided, after many years of the magazine writing about issues of freedom of expression and the foundation funding the American Civil Liberties Union and the Freedom to Read Foundation and other organizations, that maybe there was a way to elevate the work of individuals that were in the trenches, in the moment, standing up for freedom of expression, whether they were librarians or a yearbook editor or a whistleblower. And so we launched the awards with the idea that every year there would be independent judges drawn from people who themselves were real warriors on behalf of the First Amendment. And then they would make the selection of honorees, and they would be in categories that would range from law and government to book publishing and journalism. And when I left running Playboy, we sort of picked that up and do it through the Hugh Hefner Foundation that my father had put in place during his lifetime. And it's kind of a labor of love. And I consider the people who've both been judges and who have been honored kind of the best fraternity sorority you can be a part of.
And are there particular honorees that stick in your head, either from recent years or past? I've gone through some of the lists. I think there's some pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'd be hard pressed to, you hate to pick out any ones, but since we're talking about books, I'll name two books that were honored. One is by another Chicagoan, the constitutional scholar Jeffrey Stone, who wrote a fantastic book called Free Speech in Perilous Times, which really takes on the kind of the history of the tension that has existed between our avowed support for the idea of freedom of expression with our inclination at various times to say, well, I'm not for censorship, but. And he's also a gifted writer, which is not always true of scholars. And then A more recent one, which was just an eye-opener for me, was called Rap on Trial. And, full disclosure, I'm not a fan of rap music. It's not my favorite kind of music. I really had been unaware of the literal criminalization of the lyrics by prosecutors seeking to convict usually young men of color of violent crimes. So literally using as testimony in criminal cases, artistic expression that these musicians had created. So those are two that just come to mind.
Well, and I think it's important that those awards are there and that people can look at them, if they visit the website. I think that, as you said, there are a lot of books that are listed there because there are a lot of who've been awarded. And then there are just really interesting people that folks should know about if this is something that concerns them.
Absolutely go to the Hugh Hefner Foundation website, and you would be very happy if you just took a look at all of the previous, just even book winners, and you'd have a terrific reading list.
And I assume if started this in 53, 54, that Ray might have been honored by the foundation.
I would, it's interesting, we've never, in the book side, it's never been a work of fiction, but I can't imagine that Fahrenheit wouldn't have risen to the top.
And as someone who's such a staunch supporter of the freedom of speech, I'm curious, you've mentioned a couple of writers, but are there any other writers besides Bradbury that you found important to read?
There's this actually, I realize now, won one of our awards. There's I think a super important book called The Coddling of the American Mind. One of the authors was the founder of FIRE, which is an organization that works for freedom of expression on campuses, Greg Lukianoff. That is a really important book to help all of us understand why is this battle going on today? Why are there these instincts to, kind of censor, and what does it mean? So that's one for sure. And then just generally, I guess, about books, I'm pretty eclectic in my book reading interests between fiction and nonfiction and history and biography. But I always am especially touched by books that open up a window to a world that is not a world that I really understood as well as I did after the end of the book. So I found books like The Nickel Boys, or Homeland Elegies, or I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter, really impactful.
Yeah, I think, that's the beauty of the books and the things that we celebrate here is that capacity for people to reach and teach. So it's an amazing part of this. So you met Ray. You talked about meeting Ray. I'm curious. Beyond Fahrenheit 451, are there works of Ray's or anything about Ray that you really enjoyed of him as a writer?
I was very affected by The Illustrated Man, which also happened to run in Playboy. I just, that's a great example for me of something that Ray believed that I might not have understood when I was growing up, but I came to understand as an adult, which is that for the best writers, for people like Ray and say Arthur C. Clarke and others like that, science fiction is not a genre, and it certainly is not a genre that is a lesser genre as it sometimes was thought of. It's a way of thinking about the world, and it's a way of unleashing your imagination that should be sort of aspirational for all of us. One of my favorite Ray comments was that imagination is not just the ability to fantasize, it's the ability to survive and the ability to grow. And I always felt that the imagination that Ray brought to his unbelievably prolific life, as you know very well, across many types of writing, screenwriting and short stories and obviously novels, teleplays, that he was sort of the embodiment of that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's a really great look at who he is, and I think it's really interesting how, he intersected so perfectly with the foundation of the magazine and where they overlapped. We're starting to get some people who are submitting questions to us, so I thought maybe we could take some of those from the audience.
Okay.
There are a few here. I'm just going to start with Rick Pullen. Asked a question, which was, how do you feel about the Supreme Court's support of the First Amendment?
It's an interesting, the case law is interesting, and certainly Jeff Stone's book that I mentioned, as you would imagine when I described him as a constitutional scholar, does a great job of discussing the evolution of legal precedents and where the court has fallen short of really living up to it and where they've really taken principled positions. It's an interesting non-right-left dynamic. So, for example, when I was running Playboy, we wound up in front of the Supreme Court on a case that was about television, and we were the plaintiff to try and have established for the first time that cable television standards would be the same as print or the internet, not broadcast standards, which are much more restrictive in terms of subject matter and language and things. And we ultimately won that case at the Supreme Court, and that is the law of the land. And it's that decision is quoted many, many, many times. But one of the justices that voted on our side of the case was Clarence Thomas, not someone that you would expect I would agree with on very many other issues. So it's interesting to see, and I have no real sense of how this new court is going to approach the various issues. And I think we're going to find out, because we have a really interesting case coming forward, which is the cheerleader who posted on social media obscenities in response to having been cut from the squad and was punished for that. And we have a complicated history in jurisprudence about what the rights of students are for free expression, but that's a case to watch closely to see where this court is.
Yeah, that is an interesting one, and the notion of social media just being that, if she had passed a note to a friend, back in the day that said those things, would anyone have known?
Right. That's the amplification, yeah.
And so we have another question here. This is actually from Sandy Petrosius, who's the chair of the Ray Bradbury Experience Museum in Waukegan.
Cool.
His home.
Ray's hometown,
and they have on display the 3 issues of Playboy we're talking about tonight. She says, we often need to explain to visitors, especially younger visitors, the controversy surrounding Playboy. Can you recap some of that controversy when Playboy first came on the stands? What was the initial reaction? How vehement was the controversy when it first came out?
Sure. Well, even some years later, it was still the case that in most of the states of the United States, if you were not having sex in the missionary position, not using birth control, with someone you were married to and you were of the opposite sex, you were breaking the law. So we have a history that goes back to our puritanical roots that is pretty strongly anti-sexual. As an aside, when my father was studying psychology at the University of Illinois, he wrote a paper on the then newly released Kinsey report, and he got an A for style and a C- for content because the teacher did not think that that was even an appropriate topic to be writing about. So the times were one in which there was this complete disconnect between what people's actual attitudes were and their actual behavior, and the laws and the conventions. And that was, as Hef would write about in the installments of the Playboy philosophy, very much of the Judeo-Christian tradition of our country, which tends to quote lines from pop culture like Saturday Night Live, good girls aren't supposed to be interested in sex, only bad girls are, right? They're the kind of the goddess whore dichotomy. And the 50s was very much of that period, even while people like Playboy and others, when we were talking about the fermenting of change, were breaking those barriers and those bounds. So Playboy went through a lot of legal battles. Something as benign as in 1959, my dad and the magazine wanted to host a Playboy Jazz Festival. Jazz had been a long interest. I mentioned that Miles Davis had been the very first Playboy interview. Mm-hmm. It was going to be a benefit for the Urban League, and it was going to be at the Chicago Stadium. And they literally had every great jazz artist, Ella, Miles, everybody booked. And the Catholic Church put so much pressure on then Mayor Daley, the original Mayor Daley, to not allow something that was going to be called the Playboy Jazz Festival, that the permit got yanked. And at the 11th hour, Arthur Wirtz, who owned the original stadium where the Blackhawks played, and knew my dad, allowed them to move the festival indoors. But the notion that the Catholic Church would care about even just the promotion of Playboy through a jazz festival for the Urban League gives you a sense of kind of the power of enemies and the times.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. We have a comment from R. Scott. I'm sorry, I don't know what the R stands for, but wanted to thank you, Christie, for your insightful presentation. He was blessed to have your dad sign the Playboy book for me, which I cherish to this day. The work that he and you and colleagues have done for literature, politics, freedom, women's rights have helped shape my world. Warm regards.
Thank you.
So that wasn't really. Let me jump. I think Paula wanted to say, back in the 1980s, you spoke to a group of journalism students in Detroit, Michigan, when I was a teacher. What you told the students at the program had such an impact on my students, they had to discuss it on the bus ride back to school and wrote the best papers on what you had said. Much of what you're saying tonight reminds me of that afternoon because of the influence it had on 14-year-olds. So another comment.
Thank you. That is very lovely.
And then we have Michelle has a question, which is about Nicole Hannah-Jones is publishing a book about her 1619 project this fall. It's already being challenged. I feel as though nonfiction writers and musicians, as you mentioned, continue to push forward bravely, but I don't see as much the same willingness to be controversial from fiction writers as in Ray's time. Would you agree?
It's interesting. I hope that's not true. I mean, I think that, there are different forms of kind of pushing boundaries. There are artistic boundaries. So because it's much being talked about because of Barry Jenkins' series, but, I think of the Underground Railroad. I mentioned Nickel Boys earlier, but the Underground Railroad as such an astonishing piece of imagination that just, in some ways, at least for me as a reader, made everything about what it was focused on even more horrible than if it had been strictly realistic. In the same way that I found Lincoln at the Bardo sadder than if it hadn't had that strange premise of Abraham Lincoln going into the cemetery to mourn his dead son and speaking to spirits and ghosts. So there's that kind of creative risk taking. Boy, I think that, whether they're topics related to, marginalized communities, transgender or immigrant, Guantanamo Diary was an astonishing work of bravery that took forever to get published. And of course, when it finally was published, if anybody has seen it, is literally, half the book is, blacked out because that's all that the government would let him publish. And that, by the way, has been turned into a really powerful film, which I think has the same name. I think it's called Guantanamo Diary too. So I'm sure I'm not thinking of a gazillion great examples, but I would end by saying I hope that's not true.
Yeah. And I think if we think about it, there are
yeah, come on, Carrie, give us some other good examples.
You made me think of one, and then I started thinking about Guantanamo Diary. But we will come up with a list and post a.
I think that's a great. Let's make that an interactive project. Let's solicit ideas for who are the sort of brave fiction writers today. I think that'd be kind of interesting.
And I think it's interesting too. I mean, when you talk about you mentioned Guantanamo, and of course, the notion that Richard Wright had a novel that was never published that has now just been published.
And apparently, I've only read the reviews, but from what I've read, and it is also in the category of could have been written yesterday.
Yeah, it's all about police violence,
brutality,
and yeah, it's amazing, and Library of America just put that out. So I think that so who else was so brave today, and that may be part of it. Is I would never say that writers are not risk takers, but publishing houses may not be as willing.
Yeah.
I do think there are smaller presses that usually are willing, but the fact that somebody wouldn't publish Richard Wright's book is sort of indicative of the notion that it isn't that writers aren't writing it. Sometimes it's that people aren't willing to put it out there.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the positives of the development of new tools for dissemination, is that you actually can self-publish and you actually can get your words out there without having to go through the traditional publishing house.
Yeah, and that's a good thing. I have a comment and I think a question from our founder, Malcolm O'Hagan, is jumping in.
Hi, Malcolm.
He's saying, wonderful discussion. Thank you, Christie, for joining us and for being a champion of free speech. I'd like to put in a plug for Dandelion Wine, which is beautiful evocation of summer as experienced by 12-year-olds. If I was a writer, I'd be honored to have my book banned because it would indicate my book was important. Banned books are a testament to the power of the written word. Your dad and Ray were pathfinders, and we are indebted to them. What are your most endearing memories of Ray and your dad?
Yeah, now, well, I agree with you about the honored. In the same way, I know my dad was very proud of having been on Nixon's enemies list. He just thought that was a definite badge of honor. Well, I think my fondest memories of Ray would just involve sitting and listening to Ray's imagination work. And he got very interested in the design of cities later in his life. And I can remember sitting with him at my dad's house, and he would just talk about, transportation and, where you put commercial anchors versus residential, and things that you just wouldn't even imagine that he would even be interested in, never mind super knowledgeable about, and yet he would be. And he actually got hired to do some, I don't know if you could really call it city planning, but consulting for cities. And he was astonishing that way. And, he envisioned that we would explore space in the 1930s. And when he would say that he would talk about that in school, he would then say, of course, the result of that was everybody thought he was either, nuts or just too weird for words.
Yeah.
And of course, right, isn't that often true of the prophets among us? So I think those are kind of my fondest memories of Ray. And gosh, I have a gazillion fond memories of my dad for sure. So it would be hard pressed to pick one.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, you brought up the notion of cities and stuff, and there's actually a magazine in this exhibit, and I cannot remember the name of the magazine, but it's a picture of Ray on the cover, and it's about modern cities. So
yeah. Oh, great.
That period.
Oh, I'm so glad you have something, because it was really, and he was very interested in architecture, as I think I mentioned, and that's great.
Let's see. We have, another comment from Carolyn Platt.
Oh, Carolyn used to work with me.
Yeah, that's
Hi,
what she
Carolyn.
as a former employee of Playboy who had a great honor of working for Christie, whom I've always admired, I think that so many people would love to hear more about what she is speaking about tonight. I would love to know, Christie, if you have any plans to write a memoir about your work as CEO, your interest in politics that can use today, and being a champion of women in the First Amendment.
I do have a file of pitch letters from agents and publishers, and I've not been tempted to date to write a memoir, but who knows?
At some point, it's a possibility. Obviously, they would publish it in a heartbeat. I have one. This person is called Mac User. I think they need to change their profile. But they wanted to ask, Bradbury had a rather varied audience across various genres. Did he experience any blowback from publishing so many stories in Playboy that you know of?
Not that I know of. As I alluded to, I mean, you almost would be conspicuous by your absence if you were a really fine fiction writer and weren't publishing in Playboy, because they really were deeply committed to fiction. We had two great fiction editors in my life there. And I think it was amplified by the fact that also related, I think in part to my father's interests in kind of science fiction and even horror and that whole kind of interesting world, that the magazine had a deep relationship with the science fiction community. And so anybody who was kind of a part of that community, I think, felt that Playboy was a real ally in its embracing of and its respect for the great science fiction writing and writers.
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. When you look at the list of people who were published, there's not anybody who wasn't being published in that era, and who was, extremely well known. So, let me see. I've got a comment here from Jeremy Weston, who I believe you might know.
Oh, another former colleague. Hi, Jeremy.
Too long. So wonderful to visit with you tonight, get your perspectives on free speech in our complex cancel world. Do you have any thoughts on how we at least start to work to reverse some of the excesses of cancel culture? Is it a genie out of the bottle, or how can we lower the temperature?
Yeah, I do worry about it for sure. Well, on the campus side, which is only one piece of it, again, I'll give a shout out to local neighbors. The University of Chicago really was the standard bearer for a free speech code. And I give President Zimmer and actually Jeff Stone, who worked with him on it, all the credit for that. And it was really in the heyday of the kind of concern about trigger warnings and about what was being taught and what shouldn't be taught. And they just put a real stake in the ground around how essential to college education was being exposed to a diversity of ideas, being able to argue your point of view against people who have different points of view, and to do it respectfully, but not to have the so-called heckler's veto. And that has become adopted at more and more schools. And so I would say to anybody, if your alma mater isn't following the University of Chicago's guidelines and you're active at your school, I would say lean into that. I also think that it's important to something that Carrie mentioned, that we make it clear that it is possible to treat people with respect while disagreeing. At its kind of even extreme, another book that is a really important book is a book about hate speech by Nadine Strassen, who was the longtime president of the National ACLU. And that's a great example of something where, like, a whole lot of people would say, well, of course that shouldn't be allowed. It's hate speech. And you should read that book and let her educate you about what's happened in countries that have tried to criminalize hate speech, which is that it's the marginalized communities that actually get censored, and what is possible under our laws without that. So I think, it's an ongoing conversation and an ongoing need for activism.
Yeah. I I think that's important to think about. And we had Nadine Strawson, and you interviewed her.
Yes, we did. We did that over at one of the clubs.
And
I'd forgotten we did that
it feels like 100 years ago, and it was probably 2.
Yeah. I have that same warped feeling about time too.
We all do right now. I have a question from Jennifer M. What are the books you are currently reading? Which ones do you find the most engaging? And also, thank you for such an articulate presentation.
You're welcome. Well, I mentioned some books that I've found very powerful. Right now, I'm finishing Walter Isaacson's book, Codebreaker, which I'm finding particularly engaging because so much of that work around CRISPR and RNA that the scientist who's the centerpiece of it received the Nobel Prize for is so relevant to our understanding about how we're going to respond to pandemics and where science is going. So it seems like, I mean, it's a new book anyway, but it seems especially timely and relevant. And of the subjects I wish I had studied more of in high school and college, science would be really high up there. I wish somebody had along the way pushed me more in that direction. So I'm forever trying to make up for that. So I'm very much enjoying that. And then I just finished reading it happens to be 2 sort of biographies, but of the poet Adrienne Rich, who I actually had the privilege of studying with. Oh. She taught a semester at Brandeis, and it was a seminar of a half dozen prose writers, which would have been me, and a half dozen poets. And so I actually got to know her. And but this recent biography is a really fascinating and much richer telling of her life.
Oh, wow. That's wonderful. I didn't know that was out there. I think I just saw another question pop up, and we should probably make this our last one. It's from Alan Levi. Christie, do you have a hope that as a society we might be able to modify our police education and reform responsibilities anytime soon on a national level? If so, how do you see this coming about in our political severed government?
Hi, Alan and Sam. These are friends in LA. I'm not sure if you really mean police education. If that is not a spell check miscorrection, which we've all lived through, I am hopeful about reform in that area, and I think it is one of the things that as we are in the anniversary, the murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement. That I believe we've reached a tipping point where we're rethinking the things we ask our police to do. Mm-hmm. And so much of it is work that they themselves don't want to be doing, interacting with people with substance abuse problems or mental illness issues. And it serves neither them nor the society well. And if we can actually refine what their role is, and then to your point, Alan, marry that with really good training. I don't remember the numbers of the stats, but the hours that they spend on the firing range compared to the hours they spend learning de-escalation, it's like, I don't know, 100 to 1, 500 to 1. I mean, we're not helping either the large number of really wonderful policemen and women who do incredible work under very challenging circumstances by not providing them the training that we need and that they need, nor are we helping them or the society by not taking out of the police force those people who clearly should not be in the police force.
Yeah, and I think we have jumped topics a
little bit. Sorry, that took us a little bit off of Ray.
But I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that we've had a wonderful audience tonight who got to engage with you and hear from you. And I think you brought a huge amount of insight to our topics. And I think that just bringing it all back together is that we are lucky to have the capacity in this country to have conversations that are difficult. And people like Ray and your father are people who champion that, and we think it's important here. So thank you, Christie, for joining us and for having this conversation.
My pleasure, and everybody go to the American Writers Museum.
Come visit us.